Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, we'll talk in more detail about the measurements for central tendency, like the mean and the median. We'll also go through a fun exercise demonstrating the importance of using the right measurements. This lesson is building off the other lessons on distributions, so it's important that you've at least gone through the lessons that were leading up to the non-normal distributions. So let's begin by quickly reviewing how central tendency is one of the characteristics that describe a distribution.
Well, if you recall, we said that the shape of the distribution is influenced by two different characteristics. So if we have an example here of three distributions that are laid out on a scale, the first characteristic is central tendency. This is where it's referring to the location on the scale where the majority of the data points are concentrated or where they're more centralized. It's that central point where the data tends to fall, where most of those data points tend to fall like this on the scale. And for normal distributions, again, it's the mean or the average that we would tend to use for measuring that central tendency. The other characteristic is variation or spread. This is referring again to how dispersed or spread out the data is from the central tendency. So for each of these distributions, they all have varying degrees on how far spread out they are. Even though they all have the same central tendency, they are all different in how spread out they are from that central tendency. And usually for normal distributions, it'll be the standard deviation that's going to be our measurement for spread or variation.
Okay, now let's talk about the three primary ways that we measure central tendency.
There are three key measurements that we would use for measuring central tendency. The first one would be mean. That's represented by the Greek letter mu, or if we're using a sample mean, it's represented by x bar. This again represents the average that was within a set of continuous values. And the mean is what we would use as an ideal measurement when we want to measure central tendency for normal distributions. That is, those having no bias, and they're represented by a normal bell curve in their distribution. The next one will be the median, represented by the Greek letter of eta. And this is the 50th percentile, or the midpoint, for a numerically sorted set of continuous values. And it is important, though, if you're going to do this manually, that you at least numerically sort the data ahead of time. Again, they're continuous values. Now, if you have values that are even within the middle of the data set, then you would just take the average of those middle two values. And the median is what we would use when we want to as an ideal measurement when we want to measure for non-normal distributions. As we talked about in previous lessons, for non-normal distributions, the mean can be shifted if there's a non-normal distribution. And because the mean can be shifted, it's not the best or most ideal measurement for non-normal distributions, but the median will never shift. The 50th percentile will never move at that midpoint. So as such, the median would represent the more ideal central tendency measurement for non-normal distributions. Another measurement for central tendency is the mode, which is the most frequently occurring value in a set of continuous values. Now, we don't use too often the mode, but the mode does come into play, especially when we have a data set where we might see more than one mode. That is, where we might have something that's bimodal or some multimodality. We've talked about that in the lesson regarding non-normal distributions, but it is important to at least be aware that the mode is one of those things we use also as an indication for central tendency. So let's walk through an example. An example here we'll say is we want to ask the age of people who are watching Barney. So in the scenario that we'll lay out here is, in order to target their advertising, a TV network hired 3 statistical firms and asked each firm to ask people, what is the age of people watching Barney? So for the first firm, what they did was they were the first one to get the results, but they didn't validate ahead of time which Barney the TV network was referring to. So they randomly surveyed a community, but that survey community happened to be a retirement community. Without realizing it, when they asked the older folks who Barney was and if they were watching him, most of them weren't thinking of the purple dinosaur, but they were thinking of Barney Fife, who was from the Andy Griffith Show. And here are the results for that first firm and what data that they collected. The second firm, they were the next ones to get results, and they were validating ahead of time that this was the children's show Barney that they were targeting. So as a result, they randomly surveyed a community, and they got the ages for all the people who were in the home that were watching the show. Well, as part of the process, the second firm, when they were gathering their data, they found that there were also some grandparents who were with their grandchildren watching the show. So they included the age for a couple of the grandparents who were there watching the show with the kids. The third firm, they were the last ones to come back with results. And they had first validated also, just like the second firm, that it's the children's show Barney that they were inquiring about. So they randomly surveyed only the kids at daycare centers or those who were in younger communities, so that way they could target the right folks that the TV network was hoping to target. And this third firm, their data set is represented here in this third column. So based off of this data set, we want to ask, first of all, what are the central tendencies for each of these different groups? So we've got this data already in Excel, so we'll plug in here the average for each of these different groups. So for the first firm, it looks like the average comes back to 75. For the second firm, their average is 10.5, and for the third firm, their average is 4. So there's a great disparity in the average, or the central tendency, for each of these different firms. But we also want to figure out then what's the median for each one. So we'll plug in here the median for the same collected data for the first firm. That also comes back at 75, which is exactly what their average was. For the second firm, it was very different. Their median came back at 4, and for the third firm, it was also 4, which was the same as their average. So what we might say as a conclusion from some of this so far for central tendency, that it looks like the first firm and the third firm probably were random in the way they collected the data, because we can see some similarities at least between their mean and their median, but obviously there's some difference. Something is wrong with the second firm, and we can tell this obviously because we have a couple of outliers here where we included the grandparents as the age for those of the ages for folks that were collected in their data set. So the average had shifted significantly for this second firm and their data set they had. So we'd have to be very careful and account for that. Now let's look at the methods here for these next questions. That is, what are the risks each firm took in conducting their surveys and those methods that they applied in conducting the survey? Well, the first firm took the risk of not even validating what the customer wanted. And as a result, they were asking the wrong question, or they didn't first validate to make sure that the people that they were surveying understood that it was for the children's show Barney that they were inquiring about. Also, when they randomly surveyed a community, the community they had ended up going into was a retirement community. If they had already known ahead of time that they were targeting a children's show of Barney, then they should have realized that they probably shouldn't be surveying a retirement community. They might have changed it elsewhere. For the second firm, they knew that it was for the children's show Barney, as well as the third firm. So at least they were able to mitigate that particular risk because they got the clarification from the customer what they were wanting. But for the second firm, they randomly selected a community, and it was just an average any community, so it could have included some older folks, which apparently it did. It included some of the older folks, and they collected the ages for some of those older folks who happened to watch it with their grandkids. But the third firm was a little bit more careful, at least in making sure they surveyed folks who knew about the Barney show, and they wanted to get the targeted audience for that age group they expected to be watching Barney anyway. Now, if the TV network wanted to get fast results, then who was the firm that probably would have been able to get them the best answer? Well, the first firm came back with the fastest results, but again, it wasn't the right results, so they probably would throw those out altogether. But among the other firms, the second and third firm, the third firm came in last. The second firm came in after the first firm. So even though they're faster, they did have a higher average at 10.5. But having appropriate awareness of central tendency for their data set, they would have realized or could have realized that there's some outliers here. So because of these outliers, they might have known, you know what, it's okay, we can throw those out or we can ignore them, or at least in this case, if it's non-normal distribution, maybe we'll just use the median instead. And with the median, they came back to the same result as the average for the third firm. So in this case, the second firm might have been the ones who had the best results and met the customer's expectations because they were able to respond the fastest. And if they were using a proper method for central tendency, in this case if they chose to use the median, they would have been able to give the TV network exactly what they were looking for faster than the third firm.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
Well, I recommend that you identify at least 3 metrics that you use in your organization that are based on central tendency. That is, they're using some measurement of average or the mean or even a median value. And for each of those, try to ask these questions of yourself. Is the metric that you're looking at a valid measurement of central tendency? Now, in order to figure that out, what you might need to do is create a distribution of the data, or at least gather some historical data and create a distribution on it on which that particular metric is calculated. Then run a normality test on that data. Now, if the distribution comes back as normal, then it's valid to use either the average or the median for that particular metric. However, if the distribution comes back as non-normal, then it's valid to only use the median for that metric and not the average. So if the metric is not a valid measurement for central tendency, that is, if you're finding that it is a non-normal distribution and they're using the average and not the median, then I would recommend you try to do the following. Recalculate the metric using that valid measurement for central tendency, the one they should have been using. Then compare your result with the original metric that they're currently using. And based off of that, do you find that there's any significant difference between the comparisons? And if there is a difference, then how is it that the difference might affect the actions that you might normally take from that metric? And for example, would it change the targets or goals that are set for that metric? Or would it change the processes that support that metric? Or change any other behavior in how they measure performance for that particular metric? Now, be careful if you find that there is some significant impact here. Before you start to raise this up to your organization's leadership and draw too much attention to yourself, try to validate your findings or your calculations with other folks who have other experience in statistically analyzing data, because there might be something you're missing or you might have come to a different conclusion. So just be careful in how you approach this if you happen to see a finding from this. But if you do get some support from other folks who have some experience with this, then explore that with them and see if it's something that is worth elevating to identify this particular risk and how they're addressing this data.
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.